board. All right, hi everybody. I am Allison O'Connor with the CSU Extension Office in Larimer County. There are many familiar names to me who are in this room, so it's good to see your names, and I wish we could do this in person. For those of you who are new to Extension or haven't had a lot of Extension experience in the past, we are your land-grant institution, and we like to provide you with research-based information that you can use every day. So some of you may have been 4-H'ers or taken food safety and food preservation classes. And we know that this is a statewide, actually a nationwide webinar. And so we welcome you. So all of the states have extension programs. And so if you do have local questions, be sure to contact your local extension office. So it's a pleasure to have you here. Our topic today is summer blooming bulbs. These are bulbs that you plant in the spring that would bloom during the summer months. And I am actually going to turn my camera off to save a little bit of bandwidth, but I will come back on at the end when we do questions. The way it will work is if you do have a question, you can use the chat feature. So make sure that you open up the chat. If we have anything weird or strange that should occur during the session, we will immediately end the meeting. We will wait 5 minutes or so and then have people come back on, and you would use that same link. So if we feel that we have lost control of the meeting, we will immediately end it, but then we will open up the meeting again. So just so you have those housekeeping tips, video going off. Hopefully everyone can see my screen, and off we go. So summer blooming bulbs, a little bit of fancy for your garden. A note for today, I might use these terms interchangeably, and that's just a good thing for you to know. So spring planted means that they are going to bloom during the summer months. This is different than fall planted bulbs that are actually still blooming now. So fall planted bulbs would include daffodils and tulips and hyacinth and crocus. The spring planted bulbs are, for the most part, not winter hardy, and so we plant them in the spring for a summer show. And what exactly is a summer blooming bulb? Well, bulb is kind of a catch-all term for these plants that we're going to use. Essentially, these plants have underground food storage organs, and they can come in different shapes and sizes and looks. And those food storage capacities, these tubers, these bulbs, these rhizomes, they have everything the plant needs in order to bloom later on in the summer. So these group of plants include true bulbs, which are the lilies. So lilies are a type of true bulb. We also have tubers. So if you've ever planted dahlias or caladiums, those are tubers, kind of like potatoes. They're flat, more flat looking. We also have rhizomes, which are cannas, and corms, which are gladiolas. So those are the different types of underground storage structures that we're going to be discussing today. And for the most part, these plants are not considered to be hardy. So there's an extra step involved in planting these. And this is, of course, I'm speaking mostly of Colorado with our cold winters. These plants are not considered hardy, and so you will need to dig them up in the fall if you want to plant them year after year. So they're perennial, but they're not winter hardy. So you do need to dig them up. And we'll get into that. Trust me, we have lots of information. The great thing about these summer blooming bulbs is that they're really tropical looking. They can look very fancy. And what I love most is that a lot of them have these outstanding foliage. And I'm kind of a foliage geek. I love plants like coral bells or hosta, where they have these really unique leaves. And so while we get great show of flowers, they can also have these really beautiful leaves as well. So an idea of what you're looking at, because if you decide to go ahead and plant some of these, this is what you would actually be purchasing. So we have rhizomes, which are cannas up in the top left, tubers, the dahlias down in the lower left, true bulbs, and then the corms or the gladiolas. So these might look familiar depending on the type of fall blooming bulbs that you have planted, and what they turn into are flowers like this. So we have gladiolas and cannas and tuberous begonias and all these beautiful plants. And what you can see, what they have in common are outstanding colors, beautiful display of flowers, and really they add this almost magical feel to your garden, depending on where you plant them. So in terms of purchasing bulbs, the best selection is to buy online. It's not that you can't buy them from our local garden centers or nurseries. That's an absolutely great place to go. But if you are looking for particular plants in a particular color, it is always good to go online. And there are multiple places to buy. So there are places that specialize only in dahlias. There are places that specialize only in rhizomes or like cannas and places like that, or gladiolas. And if you're really into this and you might be showing some of these at shows or fairs or things like that, then you kind of step up your game. So what's available locally may not be enough to fulfill your needs. The earlier you order, the better selection there will be. So I was just on a couple of websites in the last couple of days, and a lot of things have sold out, which is great for our industry if you think about it. So people are interested in gardening this year more than ever. A lot of places are having outstanding years in terms of sales, which is also very good for the economy. But if you're looking to buy right now, just know that the selection may not be as plush as you would have had you ordered back in January. The great thing too is that these companies are very smart when they ship. So we get super excited when we get our gardening catalogs in December and January, and we might put in a dahlia order in the middle of the winter. Well, the dahlia companies know that planting dahlias in Colorado in March is not a good idea. So they'll actually delay shipment until conditions are typically warmer for those bulbs to survive. So that's a good thing too. And it's kind of fun to get them in the mail, because I don't know if you're like me, but I order things and I forgot I ordered them, or, you know, Amazon will say, oh, it'll be shipped in 3 weeks, out of sight, out of mind. And then all of a sudden I get mail and I'm super excited. Purchasing bulbs, if you want to, you can absolutely buy them from your local garden center and nursery. That's always a great way to go, especially if you're just stepping a toe into this area. The good thing about picking them out yourself is that you have the selection. You can decide how many you want to purchase, how many you want to buy, and then you can also kind of sort through the types of bulbs. So if you are able to pick them out yourself, avoid the ones that are soft or mushy. This usually means they didn't overwinter properly. They might have some decay or disease going on. And in this way, you can buy an individual bulb. You can buy an individual plant, and then you can mix and match the colors. So if you just want a rainbow of colors in your front yard or in some containers, you can go ahead and do that. Unlike if you order online, they might have you buy a minimum. And like fall bulbs, the ones that you purchase in the fall for our spring show, the bigger the bulb, the better the bloom is going to be. So that's kind of a general rule. So buy the biggest bulbs that you can find and know that you'll have a better show. There's just more nutrients, there's more carbohydrates that then encourage the blossom. In terms of planting, these are sun-loving plants. And so most of these, with the exception of tuberous begonias, which we'll talk about, they really do need full sun. So if you are in a garden that's more shady, or you just don't have a lot of sun available, you can still plant bulbs, but it might mean that you put them in containers and position them in the most sunny spots on your deck or patio. One thing to note is that in Colorado, obviously we're at a higher elevation. And so the closer you get to the sun at 5,000 feet, or if you try to grow these at even a higher elevation, just know that if you're planting dark colors, dark colored flowers, or those with dark leaves like the dahlias in the background here, the sun can actually cause some fading of those colors. So the reds and maybe the deep pinks, they might fade a little bit. Now in general, that's not really going to matter. It would only really matter if you decide to enter a flower show, and then they will judge you harshly based on the color itself. So just know that, though, that some of the colors will do better based on your exposure and the elevation that you're at. Soil needs to be well drained, needs to be pretty moist. I would say for the most part, these are not water-friendly bulbs. They're not xeric by any stretch of the imagination. So these are something that are special, that if you do want to grow them, you are giving them a little bit more water and a little bit more attention. And that's fine. So it's kind of like having our vegetable gardens. And if you want a nice cut flower garden, you can absolutely invest your resources in terms of water and maintenance into that section of the garden. So we're just using water wisely and we're using it sustainably. But for the most part, just know that since these are more tropical plants, they are used to higher levels of moisture and they do prefer a more well-drained soil. So if your native soil at your house is just poor, maybe it's a new landscape, maybe it's super compacted, then that's where maybe you decide to work that soil and loosen it up over time. And maybe for the first couple of years, you decide to put some of these plants in containers. And all of the plants I'm going to talk today will do well in containers. And for a lot of the information I have, there are specifics on how to grow them in containers. You can consider getting a soil test just to know your baseline measurements. This would be if you decide to grow your plants in your garden beds, your native garden beds. Full disclosure that right now, our CSU soil testing lab is open only to essential businesses such as farmers and agricultural producers. So they are not accepting any sort of homeowner testing at this time. That said, there are private labs available in Nebraska, and I think there's one up in Montana where you could send your soil samples if that's something you want. In general, organic matter should be that magical number of about 5%, and you could also consider adding some supplemental fertilizer at planting. The fertilizer choice is up to you. If you really enjoy blood meal, add blood meal. If you really are a fan of Scott's, add Scott's. It's up to you. So fertilizer really doesn't matter. The only thing that we would say is that apply it according to the directions on the label. So don't add more just because you think it's better. Make sure that you are applying it in the correct amount. Planting sequence is also something to consider. So we talk about this with vegetables. When we plant green beans, if we want to have a longer harvest of green beans, we might succession sow the green beans every 2 weeks. So we plant a few beans 1 week, we wait 2 weeks, we plant another set of beans, and then maybe even a third set. So what that does is actually stretches out the time of harvest that we have for the beans. And in this case, you can do the same thing with flowers. So a lot of our gladiolus growers will do this as well. They'll succession sow the corms so that they can have a longer period of bloom. So every 2 weeks, you might plant a few more corms. You'll have those spaces marked off in your garden. So maybe the back row is, mid-May. The next row is early June, and then the next row would be mid-June. And then over time, you're gonna have a sequence of blooms so that you can have longer cut flowers. Now, if you want all of your glads to come on at once, that is absolutely okay. It's just a recommendation that you can do. That is specific for glads. Some of the dahlias, some of the tuberous begonias and things like that will generally have the same amount of bloom. So succession sowing isn't as necessary, but just know that this is an option too, especially if you want to stretch your blooms into the summer or even into the fall. Using containers can be done for all of these plants. Here's the trick, is that these plants can get very, very large by the end of the growing season. So if you've ever planted an indeterminate tomato, the one that gets to be 6 to 8 feet tall by the end of the summer, if you've ever planted that in a container, you know how much leaf volume some of these plants can have. So you can use containers. You will need to have a larger container, and just like your native soil, it will need to have a well-drained potting mix. And if you plant in containers, fertilizer is absolutely 100% necessary. And the reason for that is because we're watering our containers a lot more than we would if we were watering our plants in the native landscape. So every time you water, you're leaching nutrients from the soil or from the potting media. And so you need to supplement that. And in order for these plants to do well, and this is any plant in a container, whether it's vegetables, whether it's annuals, they will need that supplemental fertilizer because they need those nutrients in order to keep going. In our native soils, we don't have as much leaching occurring, and so nutrients tend to stay a little bit better. So even if you use a potting mix that has fertilizer added where it will say, feeds for 6 to 9 months, you should start adding a supplemental fertilizer right at the onset of the bloom. So as soon as you start to see the flowers blossoming or budding, you will then want to start adding fertilizer. And again, fertilizer is your choice. What's already in the mix is usually what we call a slow release fertilizer. Osmocote is an example. So it's a coated granule that as water hits it, it will release nutrients slowly. But you can also use a liquid feed, which is what you would mix in a watering can. So you can use a combination, you can use one or the other, but just know that if you're growing in containers, fertilizer will be very important. So when to plant, the $1 million question. So bad news, it's a little too early to plant outside. You need to wait for those soils to warm up and dry down. So we have actually had, at least I'm in Windsor, we've had a pretty dry spring so far. We had some nice soaking rains over the weekend. We had a couple of good snowfalls in April, but for the most part, it has not been nearly as wet as it was the last couple years. Now, on record, May tends to be quite damp, and so we'll see. I looked at the forecast. We have a few chances of showers, but nothing like the regular rain that we had back in 2019, where it just seemed so wet and the soils never dried out and it took forever to get our gardens planted. We're not necessarily in that position. So you do, though, need to wait for those soils to reach about 60 degrees, a few inches deep. So the way to measure that is to take a thermometer. It can be your kitchen thermometer, it can be your meat thermometer, whatever can go to those lower temperatures. You can also buy special soil thermometers and then poke it into the soil and get a guess of where we're at. I would say right now, we're probably, depending on where the soils are, but we're probably still in the 50s. We'll know when it gets to be about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, our soil temperatures, because that's when crabgrass starts to bloom, or not to bloom, to germinate. So we'll start seeing some of those warm season weedy annuals popping up once the soils get to the right temperature. And if it's a hot, dry, exposed site, you might already be there, but for the most of our garden areas, we're probably not quite there. So wait a little bit. And the other thing is that we're not out of the woods in terms of freezes. And so we're still dipping into the 30s at night. And that's just a little bit too chilly for a lot of these plants. So if they start to push growth, they could get injured by those cool temperatures. So in general, we're looking at after May 15th. If you can be patient and wait until Memorial Day or even the beginning of June, you will still have plenty of time to get blooms on your plants. And I will say too that if you plant too early and we do have a lot of rain or there tends to be an over irrigation situation, the bulbs can easily rot. So do be careful on planting too early. So there is Maple the Beagle. That was when we first adopted her, and she was painfully thin, as you can tell from her ribs. She's filled out a little bit. But I was planting some dahlias the first summer that we actually brought her home, and she was scared of everything. So, oh my gosh, the creepy, crawly, scary dahlia bulbs in the ground freaked her out, and she wasn't sure what to do. So poor Maple, she has since adjusted, and now gardening is just routine practice. So with that, let's go into some of the types of plants that we're going to discuss more in particular. If you have any questions, I can take a break and you can type those in right now, and we'll take a little break and see if there's any questions that you might have. Or seeing none, we will just continue. All right. So let's talk about dahlias. Oh, dahlias are I think the plant, well, at least for me, they're the plant that I dream about. I wish I had dahlia gardens like some of the master gardeners' gardens I've seen. We have a vendor, Mitzi, who's also a master gardener, who grows the most beautiful dahlias, and I am so envious of what she does. But dahlias are, to me, just a signature summer blooming plant. They are gorgeous. There's so many different colors and shapes and sizes, and if you get into the dahlia world, it is a serious business. There's a lot of very, very talented dahlia growers, even in Colorado and northern Colorado, that have dahlia shows and everything else. So the great thing about dahlias is that they can fit into every garden, regardless of the size that you have. So there's a huge range of flower colors, shapes, sizes, and we'll actually go into the different types of dahlia flowers because there's different names for each of the types of flowers. For the most part, dahlias will need to be staked. These get to be very large plants of 4 to 5 feet tall. If you couple that with some of the wind we get, and if you're growing very large flowered dahlias, it's not going to result in a good situation. So for the most part, you do need to think about staking. Now there are shorter, smaller border type of dahlias that you can grow that maybe get to be 2 feet tall, and those don't need to be staked. So selection and size is very important depending on your gardening needs. When you plant, you'll get these tubers, and I actually have some in my car because I just did an order from a local dahlia grower, and you would plant the tubers on their side 4 to 6 inches deep. So that was the previous photo with Maple looking at the dahlia tubers. The large ones, so the large headed flower types, will need to be spaced about 3 feet apart, 36 inches, and then the smaller ones can be anywhere from 16 to 24 inches. And Susan, your question, the storage organs are called perenniating structures. Sure, yeah, that'd be fine. We could call them that. That's a very technical term, but that would make sense as to what we would call them. So this is what the dahlias would look like once you get them in the ground. Essentially, you would dig a trench if you're planting them in your beds. And again, it should be about 4 to 6 inches deep. And you're planting the tubers on their side, so the lengthwise. And again, depending on the type and how big they get, you will space them accordingly. So in this photograph, it looks like they're a shorter species, so they're a little bit more closely together. Here's the trick with dahlias. After planting, it's going to be weird, but you're not going to water them until you actually see growth coming up above the soil surface. And I know that's weird because the rule of thumb with everything is after you plant, you need to make sure that you water. But in this case, the recommendation from a lot of different resources is to let them establish, let them put on some roots, and then they'll send up their shoots, and that's when you can start to water. And I think mostly with that is that we might get a little bit too excited and try to overwater, and these are plants that do not like overly moist or too wet soil, so the tubers can easily rot. And so waiting until you see growth is a better recommendation, and then the plants are actively using and taking up the water. Using mulch in the garden, using mulch over the top will help with moisture retention and weed suppression and all of those really good things that we recommend with mulch. So again, if you're planting in your native garden beds, using mulch is going to be a great suggestion. And it is good to mark where you put the tubers. So when I planted a bunch of dahlias, this was when we first had Maple, I marked them with golf tees. Well, guess who decided to take those golf tees and place them elsewhere, just take them out of the ground? Yes, Maple the Beagles. So it is good to mark them. And if they are varieties that need to be staked, it is good to insert the stake at the time of planting. So that will also give you an indication where you planted them. Staking options will vary. It's just like staking your tomatoes. So you could use a cage, that would work. You could create a stake out of bamboo structures. In this case, they're using just rebar. This is a fancy dahlia grower. So if you get to this level, please let me know because I want to visit your property. But this is obviously someone who's growing for show. You can tell by how beautifully and neat these plants are, but also you can see that they have inserted umbrellas over the top of the plants to prevent the sun from fading the blossoms. So this is serious. My grandmother-in-law, my husband's grandma, actually grew dahlias for show for many years. She's up in Cleveland, just east of Cleveland. And seeing her garden in the summer was just, it was outstanding. So she grew lilies and then she also grew dahlias. And she would go to rummage stores and the Goodwill and thrift stores and find all of these umbrellas and buy as many as she could to protect the blossoms. So staking is necessary in many cases with your dahlias. If you do decide to stake, use something that's not going to damage the actual stem of the plant or the foliage. So green twine will work well. You just want to be careful because these plants are herbaceous, and so they're easily damaged. And so if you use something that can easily cut into the stem of the plant, that's not going to be a good thing. But essentially, you'll train the dahlia up the stake using twine every 1.5 feet or so, starting at the bottom. And again, these plants can get to be very, very large, up to 5 or 6 feet by the end of the summer if conditions are right. With dahlias, if you really want to go for maximum bloom, you will need to disbud or take off the side flowers when they start to produce. And so in this case, you can see where you need to remove. So we have the main flower here, and it's almost like when we recommend that you thin fruit from your trees. So if you have an apple tree, if you want larger apples, you will actually go in and mechanically pick them, the apples off. And what that does then is puts resources into the existing fruit, or in this case, the existing blossom. So we have 2 side buds here, and there's no shame in leaving those. If you don't necessarily care about the size of your flower, or again, you're not entering for show, you can remove those. But the thing is that these will not grow on very long stems. And so you do need to keep that in mind, that for cut flowers, if you're bringing them into the house, they won't be as long of stems, and so they may not work as well. So disbudding is a good thing to do, and it will increase the flower size that you have. Now, if you do want to plant dahlias in containers, it's absolutely okay to do. There are recommendations that dahlias really don't prefer growing in containers, and that's probably true. I've grown them on my patio for the last few years, and I would say that the bloom set is good. It's probably not as good as it would be in the garden. They're not very well adapted to containers. But there are types, especially the smaller ones, that can do okay. The big thing is the container needs to be quite large, so at least 12 by 12, and you're only planting 1 tuber per container. So it's a lot of potting media for 1 little tuber, and so that is something to keep in mind. You will plant after the threat of frost has passed, so we're looking at mid-May into the end of May. I would say end of May is a little bit safer. You'll add some potting media to the container, place the tuber on the surface, and then cover the top with 4 to 6 inches of potting media. So remember, in the garden, we're planting 4 to 6 inches deep. We're doing the same thing in a container. And again, add a stake during the planting process, unless it's one that doesn't need to be staked. Water well, and then monitor the moisture. So this is, again, where you play the dance of not watering too much and making sure that you're not saturating or causing rot on the bulb itself. And then again, once you start to see growth, you can start to water a little bit more. The types of dahlias are numerous. We're going to run through the types of dahlias just because they are so fun. I bet you never even realized how many types of dahlias there were in this world. So the biggest ones, if these are the ones that you want to impress friends and family with, you go with the dinner plate dahlias. So these are 8 inches in diameter or larger. Huge, huge flowers. These are ones that if you grow these, you will absolutely 100% need to stake the plants. That flower is just enormous. That said, the dahlia itself has been adapted to hold up the flower on the plant. So you don't need to worry about it snapping, but you do need to provide a little bit of supplemental staking. There are reliable cultivars here, and again, you will get a handout where you will have all of these available. These are just some recommendations. You can go with any dinner plate dahlia that you want. This is a photograph of my niece Ellie when she was little. I think she was maybe 2 or 3 in this picture. So Ellie lives in Oregon, and Swan Island Dahlias is one of the major dahlia growers in the United States. And so every year they have opened up their farm in August to have dahlia days. And obviously Ellie is teeny tiny compared to some of these plants, but it is, if you get out to there, I think it's in Granby, Oregon, or Canby, Oregon. If you get out to Oregon, if you're in the area, try to hit up Swan Island because it is acres and acres and acres of dahlia fields. It is outstanding. The decorative dahlias are 4 to 8 inches in diameter, so these are a little bit smaller. You'll have reliable cultivars down there. So the flowers the petals themselves on the flowers will be flat or they'll be slightly rolled. So in this case, as we get to the center of the dahlia, you can see how those petals are just slightly rolled. And they're just cute. They're just so cute. These are probably the classic cut flower dahlia that you would see. There's also the cactus and semi-cactus, named as such because the petals are mostly rolled and they do remind you of a spiky cactus. So they are, again, outstanding, a great cut flower, only 4 to 8 inches wide, and many, many different types of colors available, and there's a few. So again, don't worry about writing this down. We'll send you the handouts so that you have those for your records. I think my favorite dahlia is the ball and the pom-pom. So these are perfectly ball-shaped flowers of tightly compressed petals in there. And I just think they're so cute. They remind me of little golf balls. Maybe that's why, because I'm a slight golfer. But I also just like how they look. They're different than anything else that we would grow in the garden. They're very long lasting. So these would be a very long lasting, not only cut flower, but also they would bloom for long periods of time in the garden as well. So it almost looks like a honeycomb, but again, they're shaped perfectly like a ball, and they're come in all sorts of colors and shapes and sizes, and they're just beautiful. The water lily dahlias are very specific, and so at our Larimer County Fair, we have a water lily dahlia category. So the thing is that the flower itself, the base of the flower, is going to be very flat, so it will actually float on water. So it's placed usually in a glass bowl, a shallow glass bowl, and then it actually floats on the water itself. So it is stemless when it's cut for the most part, and then it floats on the surface. Very, very elegant if you want to, really bring your dinner parties, if we're allowed to socialize later on in the season. If you want to bring your dinner parties to a new level, maybe plant some water lily dahlias, but just know that the petals on there are mostly flat. There are single dahlias. They have just single rows of petals on there, and you can actually see the center of them a lot more clearly. So HS date, HS just stands for happy single date, and happy single flame are two very reliable cultivars, and they look a lot like daisies. And so this might be where you mistake a dahlia for a daisy, or some of the flowers start to look very similar at the end of the day. So again, a single layer of petals, and then you have this prominent center, which could be a contrasting color to the petals. But single dahlias are also very popular. Really long stems on those single dahlias. The peony flower dahlia, 2 or more layers. Again, you'll have that center eye, which looks a lot like a daisy. And there's different cultivars there too. So we went from the single level to a double, and these are considered to be peony flowers. Then there's the dwarf. They are smaller in size, so they're actually smaller in height. So that's why they're perfect for the front of a bed or for containers. So it doesn't mean that the flower size is smaller. It just means that the overall height and stature of the plant is a little bit smaller and perfect for some of those border beds. So usually less than 24 inches tall. These are ones that won't necessarily need staking. And so if you're not into that extra step of maintenance, consider the border dahlias. All right, so that's dahlias. And Shelley's question is, the dahlias I buy are a cluster of tubers. Your pictures show planting of single tubers. Should I take the clusters apart and plant each one separately? Yes, so actually what you would do is you would do division. So at the end of the season, and I have some slides on fall care, but at the end of the season, your original tuber will have expanded by 3 or 4 times what it was. So while you could replant that cluster, it would behoove you to cut them apart and then keep a couple of eyes. So just like potatoes where you're cutting them apart, you want to look for the eyes and then divide them, and then you can replant each of those individually. Good question. Okay, moving on to cannas. I love cannas, and I love cannas primarily because their foliage is so outstanding. It's just mesmerizing. I just love cannas. The flower on cannas is okay, it's fine, but really the foliage to me is where it's at. So cannas are your thriller plants. These are the ones that are big and beautiful and blooming and really remind you of being somewhere in the tropics. And the foliage tends to be variegated, which is also really nice. We have some nice variegated plants in the garden, but the variegation on cannas can be really outstanding. So you can grow cannas in water gardens or ponds. So you actually sink the entire plant with the pot into the garden and they'll grow fine, or they do quite fine above ground as well without being surrounded by water. You'll plant the rhizomes about 6 inches deep and then 18 inches apart. So remember, these plants at the end of the summer will get to be quite large, so you want to give them adequate space. And like the dahlias, if you're planting them in containers, you will want to plant only one rhizome per container unless it's a huge container. So if you ever go to any botanic gardens like Denver Botanic or Missouri Botanic or some of those places, they always usually have these summer blooming bulbs stationed on with containers. Some of them are huge, but managing something at the homeowner level of a container that large, usually not very, it's a lot. It's a lot of weight, it's a lot of potting media. We don't have all the money in the world, and so usually one rhizome per container is going to work. The great thing about cannas is that you usually don't have to stake them, but you do want to keep them out of prevailing winds. And so if your patio or your deck is just known to be a windy place, staking won't hurt it. It will help it because at the end of the season, these can act a lot like wind sails where they can just tip over because the foliage is so large. So a couple photographs of cannas planted with different things. And the one on the left, you can see we have the caladiums, which are coming up. So those are just all foliage plants. And then we have the cannas above it with that yellow and green variegation. And honestly, I would probably cut the flowers off and just have the foliage, but that's totally up to you. The one on the right has even different variegation. We have, it looks like ornamental peppers in there and maybe some ornamental grasses and just beautiful. So cannas can obviously be the thriller of the container, the tall thing, the tall plant that really makes a statement, which is nice. It will give your containers a lot of great height. A few more pictures. So again, the variegation on these leaves is outstanding. This one is obviously kind of a pinky red with streaks of green, just beautiful. And when it's backlit by the sun, I think it just adds that extra element. So the foliage is really great. A couple cannas to consider. You can buy them based on the foliage themselves. There are plants with just plain green foliage if you want that. And then of course you'll have the showy flowers. If you want one with more the burgundy bronze foliage, because that goes better with your garden, that's an option. Or you can look at those with variegated foliage. So Jeremy has a question of what is your take on using a garden auger? I'm assuming you're asking in reference to planting these bulbs. Is that, can you just clarify? Okay, so that would be fine if that gives you an extra leg up, because digging, in some of these cases, digging 4 to 6 inches deep can be a huge chore. A garden auger will make things much easier. Absolutely, you can do that. There's ones that attach to the drill, and then there are self-standing ones as well. So kind of like, I grew up in Minnesota, so drilling ice pockets when you're ice fishing, that's kind of like what an auger is. A couple other photographs. So Cleopatra, I mean, let's talk about that foliage because there's nothing else in the garden like that. It's just outstanding. And then Black Knight is a very, very dark colored foliage, almost black with hints of green, and then that kind of carmine red flower. And that contrast of black and red is really just outstanding. So cannas are wonderful. Okay, moving into lilies. Lilies are true bulbs, and only plants in the Lilium genus are true lilies. So daylilies are not a true lily. They are aspects of lilies, but the genus Lilium includes the true lilies. So that's just a botanical clarification. It really doesn't mean anything to this talk. But for the most part, the flowers on lilies are going to be very large and showy. They're usually trumpet shaped, but they do have different looks to their flowers themselves depending on the type that they are. The flowers may be more upright, they may nod down, they may face out, and so the flowers of them are very, very friendly. There's a lot of movement to the lily flower, and there's a huge variety of colors as well. And lilies are one that can have a fragrance. We'll talk about lilies with fragrance. So planting lilies, again, full sun, like the others we have discussed. You can plant larger bulbs, about 4 to 6 inches deep. That's kind of the trend. So most of these tubers, rhizomes, and bulbs will need to be planted about 4 to 6 inches deep. If you have smaller lilies, which there are, you can plant those a little bit more shallow, so 2 to 4 inches deep. And then space them about 8 to 12 inches apart, unless you want to cram them into a container, as shown here, and then you can plant them a little bit more closely together. In this case, we are really going for more show as opposed to having a long-lasting bloom. So we are going to cram them together, but just know if you plant them this close, they're going to need more water, more fertilizer. So be prepared to take on those extra maintenance characteristics. And they are better grouped in mass. So while some of the other ones are better to have planted as solo plants, these true bulbs, these lilies, want to be planted together. They'll just look a little bit better. They'll be more of a statement in the garden. And container grown lilies, if you buy them from a nursery already planted in a container, you can plant those at any time during the growing season. So if you're out and about this weekend and hitting up a couple of the garden centers, they'll have lilies that you can actually purchase from containers. You can plant those out, but if you're starting from the bulbs, wait till that mid-May to early June timeframe, because they're just not, they haven't hardened off yet. The types of lilies that you'll normally see are the oriental lilies, the Asiatic, and then the Turk's cap. Here's the thing about lilies. Unlike everything else we'll discuss, for the most part, these are plants that are going to be reliable perennials, which means that you don't have to dig them up in the fall. Yay! So if you're not into the added maintenance of digging plants up, then go with the lilies. So they should come back year after year. I have had fairly good success. There's a couple that haven't survived, and it was probably a moisture issue. In my garden, it's always a moisture issue. But for the most part, lilies can be treated as a perennial and left in the garden year after year. So Asiatic lilies are the first to bloom. They are also incredibly easy to grow. They're not very picky about soil type as long as it's well drained. So if you have a spot that you're like, I don't know if bulbs will do well, I don't know if it's well drained enough, give the Asiatic lilies a try. They're pretty tough plants and they're not overly picky. They're also very hardy and they don't need staking. That's a really positive thing with the Asiatic lilies. They also have the widest range of colors, and they have upward, so their flowers face up or out. And then the petals are often flecked with dark spots. So that's a pretty characteristic sign of the Asiatic lilies. They're the first to bloom. So you're looking at blooms usually in June, maybe July. It's hard to say because every year is so different and it depends on where you live. And a wide range of heights. So anywhere from 2 to 5 feet tall, depending on the cultivars that you buy. The Asiatic lilies will not have a fragrance. So that might be a good thing for you, or it might be a bad thing. It's up to you. A couple cultivars to consider. The top right is Connecticut King. It's a deep golden yellow, heights 3 to 4 feet, and this is going to bloom in June. And I would say that probably mid to late June is normal for this plant to bloom. Crete is a deep pink, 3 to 4 feet tall again, and it's going to bloom a little bit later than Connecticut King into June and July. So those are two that are very cold hardy, and they should do well in most parts of Colorado. So if you do want a perennial lily that does come back year after year, I would go with the Asiatic lilies and maybe consider one of these two types. The Oriental lilies are incredibly popular. They are taller than your Asiatic lilies, up to 3 to 6 feet tall, I would say. So that was like a generalization. I would say in Colorado, I've never seen a lily 6 feet tall. That's just crazy. I would say more 3 to 4 feet tall is going to be typically what we get for our lilies in Colorado. They will bloom again after the Asiatic lilies are done. So if you love lilies and you want the sequence of blooms, plant some Asiatics and then also plant some Oriental lilies so that you have a longer period of bloom. They are going to do best when they are protected from hot afternoon sun and the wind. So if you're thinking about where to site these in your landscape, probably an east-facing landscape so you don't have the afternoon sun, and then again, out of the prevailing winds. They're kind of wimpy plants. They're not going to do super well when it's really windy or if it's really hot. So put them in a more sheltered location. And the Oriental lilies are the ones that are heavily scented. So if you love the smell of lilies, these are the plants to buy. And they're not nearly as winter hardy as the Asiatic types. So you will want to heavily mulch them and tuck them in for the winter. So when they're done blooming at the end of the fall, you are going to want to mulch them and really protect them for the winter months, because they're like hardy to zone 5B and sometimes 6. So depending on where you live in Colorado, if you're up in Fort Collins or Windsor, you're probably zone 4 to 5. In the Boulder area, you're maybe 6, down into Denver, 5 or 6. But if you're up in Estes or Red Feather, these are not going to survive for you. So just be aware that they're not nearly as hardy as the Asiatic types. A couple to consider though, Black Beauty, she's on the top right. So dark red flowers, they look very similar, I understand that. They're going to have a green central star, so if you look down into the flower, you can see the throat of the petals and how it's green. And then Stargazer, which I think most people have actually heard of, is a very popular Oriental lily cultivar. It's shorter, deep pink, so it's a deeper pink, more of a almost like a hot pink burgundy color. And again, you'll have that kind of green star that forms with the petals itself. So Oriental lily cultivars will bloom after the Asiatics, which bloom in June and July, and then the Orientals will come on in July and August. So a late summer bloomer, but again, they're scented, so it's a nice thing. And then the last lily is the Turk's cap. These are very unique. They are totally reflexed, so the petals are bent backwards and their heads droop down. So the heads droop down and then the petals are bent backwards. And there's all sorts of different types of interesting Turk's cap lilies that you could buy. The flowers usually are in the shades of orange and yellow or white. There are burgundy types, and then they usually have this really interesting speckledness on the petals themselves. They bloom a little bit earlier, so probably about the same time as the Asiatic lilies, and they can range in height from 4 to 7 feet. Okay, I saw there was a question. So, oh, thanks, Tony. So Betsy had a question of deer resistance of dahlias and other summer blooming bulbs. So Tony answered that dahlias really aren't favored food for deer, but like everything, like rabbits, like anything that nibbles on our plants, if they're hungry enough and there's not enough food supply for them, they will try them. So if deer are a problem, I might encourage you to put them on the patio unless you have deer visiting your patio. You very well could be. Deer are pretty precocious and like to visit everywhere. Okay, gladiolus. So gladiolus to me, it brings back so many memories. So my mom had an older friend whom she worked with, or my mom worked at a senior adult center. And so this gentleman would come and visit her, and he would bring her gladiolus when they were in bloom. His name was Pete. And Pete, we got to go to his garden, and I was little, maybe 6 or 8 or 10 years old. But this was a very striking memory for me. So Pete and Inez had gladiolas, and Pete loved to grow them, and he would have rows and rows and rows of gladiolas, and going to visit him when they were in bloom was such a special treat. They also had a pond, and they had frogs. I remember that because you could hear the frogs. It was really fun for a kid. So gladiolas remind me of childhood, and they're a very old-fashioned plant. They have been around for a very long time, and they're a spike plant. So if you don't have a ton of garden space, this is the plant for you because you only need like, a couple inches per plant to have in your garden. And the other cool thing is that gladiolas come in every color. So they have bicolored flowers. They also have a pure green flower, which is really unusual. So it's kind of like this, it's not mint, it's kind of this yellowy green, but it looks great. I think we need more green plants, more green flowers on green plants. So gladiolas are a corm. You would plant the corms about 3 inches deep in the soil once the soils have warmed. So again, after mid-May, and then keep them about 6 inches apart. You could go a little bit closer if you want, but 3 inches deep and 4 to 6 inches apart. Glads are great because they're nice and tall, so you could line them along the back of a flower border if you just want some height in the garden, or maybe it's just something unusual to plant. They're a great cut flower, but they also look really nice in the landscape as well. If you do want to cut them, once the blooms start to open, they'll start at the bottom and work their way to the top. Cut when there's just 1 or 2 flowers open along the stem. So the first couple flowers will open at the bottom. That's when you cut them, and then they'll continue to bloom once you put them in water indoors. So the gladiola cut flower industry, this is obviously, this is a cut flower grower. It's in South America somewhere, and they are cutting them a little bit before that because they need to make the transport to where they are shipped. But this is the stage at which you would want to cut. So a couple of the flowers should be open, and then the others along the raceme will start to bloom when they get a little bit larger. Gladiolas will do well in a container. Again, you'll need a fairly large container, at least 12 by 12, so about the same size as you do dahlias, and plant them 4 inches deep, and you're going to plant them a little bit closer together, and that's okay because you're planting for the maximum bloom impact. So you can plant them on 2-inch centers instead of 4 to 6-inch centers like you would in the garden. And these are the plants that I mentioned you might want to succession sow. So if you want to have gladiolas over a longer period of time, you could plant the corms every 2 weeks and then continue to have them to add to your flower bouquets or however you decide to use them. If you don't want to cut them, that's fine. You can leave them in the garden. Then as the blooms start to fade and as they start to wither, you would remove the blooms, and then you'll need to wait for the plants to wither and brown like you would with the rest of your spring blooming bulbs that you would have. So you want to let them photosynthesize and provide those nutrients into the corm. If you do cut them, just know that those corms, you're going to be treating them like an annual, because there's not enough foliage to make sure that they can produce in subsequent years. So that is a tricky thing. Moving on to Crocosmia. This might be one that you're not too familiar with, but it is super, super fun. Crocosmia it's borderline hardy. So if you do plant this, depending on where you live, you'll probably need to protect it in the winter or hope for the best. That's kind of my philosophy. I'll hope for the best. Hopefully it will come back. This is one I'm planning on planting this year because it is so spectacular. So Crocosmia are corms native to southern and tropical Africa, so not anywhere near the state of Colorado, which is why it's only marginally hardy. It is a hummingbird attractor. So because it's red, because those tubular flowers are perfect for hummingbirds, if you have hummingbirds in the area, this would definitely be a plant that you want to put into your garden. And it blooms in mid to late summer, which is really nice. So I feel like we get into kind of the doldrums of the summer where we have August and things are just kind of hot and tired. That's when Crocosmia would come on, and it would really add a little bit of perkiness to your garden. So plant your Crocosmias when you decide to plant your dahlias after the spring frosts have passed. So again, you shouldn't do this for another couple weeks. And it is one that can deal with a little bit of shade. So Crocosmia will do well in shade. Full sun is okay, but you might want some afternoon shade on these plants for the best performance. The corms will be planted 6 to 8 inches apart and then 3 to 5 inches deep. And you'll want to plant them in mass, so plant several bulbs together for maximum show. So up to a dozen or more for an area, and then each of those will send up a bloom, and it will be absolutely outstanding. A couple to consider are Lucifer. Love that name, Lucifer, because it's just so fiery red. Flower stalks, the flowers are 4 to 5 feet tall. So I would say, I was talking to someone who actually has grown a lot of Crocosmia, and they said generally the flower stalks get to be 3 to 4 feet tall, which is still an impact. So imagine having, 6 to 8 or 10 of these plants grouped together, all 4 to 5 feet tall. Oh my goodness, it's awesome. So scarlet red plants, again, a hummingbird attractor, and just a beautiful addition to the garden. Another one is Carmine Brilliant. So not nearly as deep red as Lucifer, but they are kind of more of a pinky red. They have a little bit more yellow to them, so you can see the yellow stamens pointing out, and a little bit shorter. So if you don't want to plant quite that tall, Carmine Brilliant is only about 30 inches tall. And this one, though, is hardy to zone 6. So if you're in Fort Collins, Loveland, Windsor, Greeley, I wouldn't try it unless you have the most protected spot in your garden. So be careful with this one. It will survive some winters, but not all of them. And then the last Crocosmia is Ember Glow. To me, this looks so much like an orchid. I think it absolutely is beautiful. So up to 40-inch stems, and this one is hardy to zone 5. So this one you could give a try. I read this about cutting Crocosmia if you want to cut them for cut flowers, and it was really an interesting thing. It was a very detailed fact sheet, and I'm trying to remember what university it was from. I think it was somewhere down south. So this is their recommendations if you want to have long-lasting Crocosmia stems. So you would cut the stems when the first few flowers are opening, so a little bit like your gladiolas. So as the flowers are starting to open at the base, that's when you would cut your stems. You would strip off all the leaves, and then you would recut the stems once you bring them inside and put them in 100-degree water in a cool, dark place. So I'm thinking 100-degree water in a bucket, maybe in the basement or somewhere where it's going to be a little bit cooler. You'll know that spot in your house. And then you let the flowers hang out for 48 hours. So for 2 days, you're letting them hang out in condition, and if you do this, then you will have long-lasting blooms. I think they said up to 2 weeks or longer. So that's a pretty long cut flower bloom, which is really exciting. This process is completely perplexing to me. But again, it was a research university that submitted this publication, and so I have nothing to do but trust them. But I would love to know if anybody does this, and if you have longer blooms. It'd be a fun research study to see if this actually does work. So if you are growing cut flowers and selling bouquets or anything like this is probably something you want to consider, just so your clientele has a little bit longer bloom. And caladiums, I adore caladiums, again, because they're really more of a foliage plant. I did a summer internship at Callaway Gardens in Georgia, and their gardens and the golf course areas were packed full of caladiums. Everywhere you looked was caladiums. And so one of the jobs I did in the summer was give tours of the greenhouse and talk about how the caladiums were produced and how they grew them. And we would go into these greenhouses in Georgia in the middle of summer, and it was hot. Let me just say, it was very, very hot. But caladiums are a wonderful foliage plant, and they're great for containers. They're a perfect filler, not hardy to Colorado. So we talked about the lilies, we talked about the Crocosmia that might survive most winters. Caladiums are absolutely not hardy at all. They're considered to be very old-fashioned. So they've been in cultivation since the 1700s, so they've been around forever. And what's super cool is that the difference in the caladiums and how they're variegated in their coloring and their contrasting margins, there's so much variegation that it is really fun. And so there's a caladium for everyone. Their colors are predominantly green, white, pink, or red. So those are the combinations you'll get for this foliage. And there are no stems. How interesting is that? So they have petioles, which is that long thing that attaches to the leaf. And so on trees, we have petioles, but there's no true stem. So the petioles actually come directly out of the ground or the potting media or however they originate. So that's the petiole on there. That's just interesting. You don't need to really care about that. The two types of caladiums you'll find are the fancy leaf and then the lance leaf. The fancy leaf caladiums are huge. They are heart-shaped, they are very, very large, and they have the longest petioles. So that stem that attaches to the leaf, they'll have the longest petioles up to 30 inches long. So really showy. And you could absolutely use these as cut flowers. Depending on the size of the arrangement, you might need one for the entire arrangement. But they are really, really showy, and the plants themselves will produce multiple leaves per bulb, and then you have this outstanding show of beautiful foliage. The lance leaf caladiums are a little bit smaller. They almost look like arrowhead houseplants that we grow, so they have that kind of similar shape. So a little bit longer, a little bit more pointed, not nearly as heart-shaped as the fancy leaf caladiums, and they might have slightly ruffled edges, and their petioles are also shorter. And they will have more leaves per tuber. So if you're looking for maximum foliage production, consider the lance leaf caladiums. You'll just get more bang for your buck. But if you like the big, showy, whopper leaves, you'll go with the fancy leafed caladiums. They are corms, and so you only need to plant them a couple inches deep, and you'll plant them first indoors. This is if you want to have foliage. You could wait to plant them outside, but just know that it's going to be a little bit longer to actually get foliage on the plant. So if you want to jump the gun and have a little bit of foliage going into the garden after frost, you could start them indoors. So maybe a little bit too late to do that this year, although you could plant them this weekend and still have some good success. So with the corms, plant the pointy end up, and then keep them warm until you can move them outside. And then you will want to harden them off. So what that means is that you'll bring them outside for a couple hours to get used to the outdoor conditions, then bring them back inside. The next day, bring them out for a little bit longer, bring them back inside. And so it's that adjustment period. If you take them from inside and immediately move them outside, it's going to be too much of a shock. They're going to kind of freak out. They might not do well. They might die. So that hardening off, and this is important for any of the plants you buy, including your tomatoes and peppers that you get at the greenhouse, to do that hardening off. And so make sure that you're acclimating them to the outdoors, essentially is what that means. So caladiums, to answer your question, they do really well in shade. And I would say that they're more of a shade, a part shade to a full shade plant. In full sun, I would suspect that they would get a little bit of sun scorch or burning. So you might get away with an eastern facing landscape, but they would prefer definitely afternoon shade. And then here are a couple different cultivars that you can consider based on your personal needs. I find White Christmas to be absolutely beautiful. I think that looks so great. Other people might think that it looks diseased. There are caladiums that have speckles on the leaves. There are ones that might look very unique. So again, it's a very personal taste depending on what your garden is and what you like. And tuberous begonias, these are one that we generally buy as plants. And so when you go to the garden center, if you have a spot that needs some brightening, a shady spot that needs some brightening, you can buy tuberous begonias that are already ready to go. But just know that you can also buy the tubers and plant them for your garden. So tuberous begonias come in many different colors and many different shapes. If you're familiar at all with begonias, you know that some of the flowers look like little roses like they are here. There are some that are more single. There are some tuberous begonias that have very unique flowers, and there's been a number that have been introduced via the CSU annual trial gardens every year, and there are some outstanding begonias. So if you think begonias are kind of like meh, been there, done that, look at some of the new begonias that are out on the market because they are really, really fun. So begonias are one that you absolutely should plant in the shade for most of the day. They cannot tolerate the hot afternoon sun. That is an absolute no, they won't do well. They are not hardy, but you can bring them inside as houseplants, so they can be overwintered. And John's question, are caladiums good houseplants? I'm gonna have Tony look that up because I don't know if they would keep their foliage all year or if they would go through a dormancy period. So Tony, if you don't mind looking up caladiums and how you could maybe overwinter indoors, that would be helpful. So the begonia flowers come in many different colors. Usually the foliage is a very dark green. There are some variegated forms, which I think just detracts from the flowers. So in this case, these look like little carnations to me. So colors of red, orange, yellow. They can be double flowers. They can be plain. The flowers can be ruffled or toothed. And so there's a lot of different variegation to the flowers themselves, which makes it really fun for you when you're shopping. And then the petals may have margins, crests, or blotches of contrasting colors. So in this case, we have the edges of the petal in the red, with the petal itself being more of a light pink to a white. So absolutely gorgeous. The tuberous begonias, I'm not gonna lie, they kind of look like hardened poo, but they are tubers, so remember that. So they look different from the dahlias, which are also tubers. So that is what the tuberous begonias look like. They don't look like much, but fortunately they turn into really beautiful flowers. So again, you can purchase tuberous begonias as starts from garden centers. So when you're doing your annual shopping, you can find tuberous begonias and just purchase those. Absolutely okay. If you want different looking flowers, or maybe you have a specific color in mind, that's when you would probably go to an online catalog or mail order and really find what you want. Ideally, the tubers, if you're purchasing them, would be started in March or April. You can even start them in February. So the earlier you start them indoors, the earlier they'll bloom. So if you did a February start, they'll bloom in June. If you do a March, April start, they'll bloom in July. So if you can find them, I wouldn't say it's too late, but just know that you'll probably have a late July to August bloom, as opposed to having it earlier in the summer. When you get your tubers, you can plant them in a flat, so just a plastic tray of just peat moss or vermiculite. So vermiculite is that goldy flecky stuff that you see in potting mix, but peat moss will work as well. The upper surface of the tuber has a depression or a hollow. So I'm trying to point that out here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's a depression there. That is the top. So try to get the top pointed up, and that will definitely benefit. And then you're going to cover the tubers themselves, just covered with peat moss or vermiculite following planting. Keep them medium moist but not wet if you have access to a sunny window, if you have heat mats, if you have all of that, you can absolutely do that indoors, that's fine. But really, begonias are pretty tolerant. They don't need a lot of things. Supplemental light will keep them shorter. So the problem I think with growing with a lot of starting things indoors is that they get leggy. And these plants could get leggy too. So having a light source that is closer to them to keep them more stocky will be of benefit. But again, it depends on how early you start them indoors. If you're starting them in March or April, they shouldn't get too leggy. But once they start to push growth from this stage, you'll actually take them out of that medium and put them into a container, which is then what you would transplant to the garden or to another container outside. So there is a two-step to this. This is where you would start them in the flats, and then you would transplant them to another container for planting outdoors. The watering is going to be hit or miss. So you don't want them too wet, you don't want them too dry. So it's really that Goldilocks watering method. And you definitely don't want any sort of moisture accumulating on top of the tuber surface. So that little indent should never have standing water in there as you're getting those tubers germinated. And then again, harden them off before putting them outside. That's a big thing. So let's quickly talk about fall care of bulbs, and then we'll answer any other questions that you have. So for the most part, in general, these bulbs should be dug from the ground, except for the ones that are hardy, but a lot of these are tender bulbs, so they're not going to survive the winter months. You're going to let frost kill them, and then you're going to dig them up from the ground. There are exceptions. There's always exceptions. It's plants. Once the frost has killed them, you can cut the foliage to 6 inches above the ground. So a first frost comes through, and it's going to be one that's maybe 30, 32 degrees. This is in the fall. If a hard frost comes through, it's not going to be as good for the plant. So watch those fall nighttime temperatures and make sure that it just doesn't get too cold for them. But it is better for the plants to experience a light frost to basically stop their growing process and kind of kill them in their tracks. And then after that happens, you'll cut the foliage to 6 inches above the ground, and then you'll dig them up. So this is where it is important to make sure that when you're digging, you don't stab the bulb with whatever device you're using. Whenever I plant garlic, it is inevitable that I am going to stab the bulb of garlic during the digging process, and then I know I have to eat that bulb very quickly because it's never going to store long periods. So if you do make a mistake and you happen to slice through part of your tubers or your rhizomes, just know that it's probably better to throw them away than to try to store them, just because it opens up disease and other things that can come in. So using a spade or a trowel or even like a metal pitchfork, you're going to wiggle that in and then dig them up. Using the stem of the plant as something to pull on might not be the best idea. If that stem separates from the bulbs themselves, it can open up another wound. So it is better to try to loosen or fully dig them up as best you can. And then anything that's cut, nicked, damaged, you'll want to cut that off and get rid of it. So loosen the soil and then lift the plants from the ground. And then if you are a very good gardener, which I am not, you are going to label everything. Everything that comes out of the ground hopefully had a label going in. So if you had fancy dahlias that you want to remember what they are, you will want to then label them. You can use a Sharpie on the bulb itself. You can add a plant tag during the harvesting process, whatever works for you. Or if it's whatever, it's a free-for-all, I don't care, you can skip that step. After you get the bulbs out of the ground, you'll want them to cure. And this will depend on the bulb itself. So it might be just a few hours or it might take a couple weeks. If you have some sort of screen, so this is just hardware cloth or maybe even chicken wire or an old window screen lying around, that is a perfect place for you to place your bulbs to cure. Leave them in a cool, dry place. I probably wouldn't leave them outside because we just get weather and other things like that. So maybe the garage or another location where they can just hang out for a little bit. If you don't have a screen, you can lay them on paper or cardboard and then just make sure you're turning them often. So every day, flip them around so that they're not sitting, because they're going to be moist. There's going to be moisture in there, and you want them to fully dry out before you put them into into storage. And then, of course, keep them out of the sun. So general storage tips for these bulbs, you can store the dried bulbs between 2 to 3 layers of peat moss, sand, vermiculite, shredded paper. So if you are shredding documents because you're doing some spring cleaning, save that and use it to store your bulbs later on. You can also use wood shavings or coconut husk, shredded coconut husk. That would be fine. If you have many, you can layer them in the box. So put some material down like your sand or your shredded paper, add a layer of bulbs, keeping them all apart, make sure they're not touching at all. Then you can add a layer of your packing material, you can add more bulbs and continue that process. And cardboard works fine. Cardboard's actually a little bit more porous. It's probably a better choice than a plastic tote. And then don't cover them. That's the big thing, is that you don't want to have a tight fitting lid on top of the boxes because that can trap moisture and just doesn't allow for good air circulation. Storage temperature. So the perfect temperature will be between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit with a relative humidity of about 50%. I don't know who has those temperatures in their house. I certainly don't. Maybe the basement, but again, Colorado winters are pretty darn dry, so that relative humidity thing is a big deal. The thing what I think we've experienced most with storing our bulbs is that they dry down. So they will lose significant volume of moisture during the winter months. They also will recover sometimes. If they're too shriveled by the time spring rolls around, you'll know. You can then just discard them. But it does maybe behoove you to check on the bulbs a couple times during the winter months to see how they're doing. It might benefit you to spritz them with a little bit of water just to help stop some of that moisture loss. But those are the ideal temperatures. Check them, again, spray them, and then look through them. If you smell something funky in your bulb storage, something went wrong, something is rotting, so make sure that you're getting rid of that, because you don't want to have that spoil the entire batch. So make sure you do check them every once in a while. It's hard to remember because they're out of sight, out of mind. So dahlias, this goes to the question that was asked earlier. So dahlias specifically, you'll dig them before a hard freeze. So a hard freeze is anything below 26 to 28 degrees. The tops can be exposed to a light frost. That's fine. So 30, 32 degrees, totally fine for the dahlias, but you do want to dig them before we have that first hard freeze. The roots, the tubers, are super sensitive, so they can be easily bruised. So when you're digging them from the ground, be extra careful. If you want to wash them gently in water following digging to remove some of the soil, you absolutely can. And then you will need to you'll need to cure them for at least several hours before placing in storage. You can do it a day or two, that's fine. Check for dehydration, mist them as necessary. And the general recommendation is to wait until the spring to divide, just because making a fresh cut on these plants in the fall might result in some disease that could occur. So it is better to leave this clump and wait until the spring, and then you can go ahead and do that. So this is your clump that you have. I'm sorry, I can't remember who asked that question. So the X is where the mother bulb was. So this is the original bulb that you purchased. She's dead and gone, so you can get rid of her. And then all of these tubers were the ones that formed during the season. And so you see where the arrows are pointing to the eyes. Those are the tubers that formed. And so that's where you would then make your cuts. So you would cut there, and those would have enough resources then in order to bloom next year. So you'll discard the mother bulb and then replant those new tubers. So they do replicate, which is great. So you buy one bulb and then you can have them for years and years. So from that example, this is the number of bulbs that they actually got, or the new set of tubers that they got from that clump that they had. There's some really, really good videos on YouTube of how to do this, because the pictures that I showed you were terrible. It's hard to see. But just know that there's additional information out there. So into your search engine, just type, dividing dahlia tubers, and you'll find tons of information. Plus, the mail order companies that supply these bulbs have wonderful information on fall storage and how to also divide them. So look at those resources before you do anything. With the cannas, so the cannas, remember, with their cool foliage, the cannas allow the frost to kill the tops, but again, not a hard freeze. That is where really, really what you need to watch in the fall, is when those temperatures drop. You'll want to cure them for a day or two, and then you can clean those roots, but it is best not to wash them. So they don't really like moisture, but just kind of rough off the soil. And as that soil dries, it will be easier to remove. When it's wet from the garden, it doesn't like to flake off, but as things dry down, it's going to be easier. And then, like the dahlias, wait until spring to divide, and then make sure that you have at least 3 eyes per division. Gladiolas, in this picture you can see the gladiola. This is the old gladiola, and then the new one that has formed. So this one has spent its life and then formed new ones. So that's the one that you want to discard and then keep this one. Gladiolas are, I would say, they're fairly inexpensive, and so digging them up, because you usually plant a lot of them, I don't know if it's worth your time. You'll have to decide that. So when I plant gladiolas, I just consider them an annual. I plant them and then I don't dig them up in the fall and just repurchase them the following season. But it's totally 100% up to you. You're going to lift them after the first frost, and then these are another one that you don't want to get wet. So the corm should not get wet, just because moisture gets trapped in some of those little crevices. And keep them for a day or two, maybe 3 days, in a bright location, and then you'll want to cure them for up to 3 weeks before you put them into storage. And you can snap off that old corm during this process. That's totally fine. And with caladiums, because they are not winter hardy at all, they are probably the most tender of all the bulbs. You'll want to lift them before frost. So watch those temperatures when we get into maybe the mid 30s to high 30s. That's when you'll want to actually lift the caladiums, or make sure you bring them inside. Allow them to dry for about a week, and then the foliage will start to yellow and wither and die, and then you can cut the foliage back. And unlike the other bulbs, there's always one in the bunch, right? Unlike the other bulbs, caladiums need to be stored at about 60 degrees Fahrenheit all winter long. The others were, again, 35 to 45 degrees, but caladiums, they like it a little bit warmer. And I see that Tony responded to the question about that caladiums really don't do well as houseplants because they need this period of rest. So it is better to dig them and then overwinter them and have them in the garden year after year. And with the tuberous begonias, dig before a hard frost. You can let a light frost touch them. That's totally fine. Let those, the tubers dry for a couple weeks, and then keep a little bit of foliage on there before, as they're drying down. Then you can remove that foliage and keep them in storage. And these are ones that, again, need to be stored a little bit warmer, about 50 degrees. So it is good to have a thermometer in these areas so that you know it's not too cool or too warm for the plants as they're overwintering. A couple final tips as we wrap up. If it's too much work, totally fine. Just consider them an expensive-ish annual. That is absolutely 100% okay. I have had years where I've bought dahlias and I have every ambition to dig them up in the fall, and then fall comes and I am just tired. I'm over gardening. I don't want to dig anything, and so I just let them go. You'll have to decide and make those decisions for yourself, but you can absolutely treat all of these as annuals. It's just depending on what you want to do. Now, if you invest, 15, 20 bucks in one tuber, yeah, you'll probably want to dig that one up in the spring, but again, or in the fall, but it's totally up to you. Buying in bulk is going to be cheaper. So just like when you plant your fall bulbs, if you buy 50 daffodils as opposed to one daffodil, buying 50 is going to be a better price per bulb. The same thing with the summer blooming bulbs. And then try new things, see if there's something that will really work well in your garden, like crocosmia, or this is lily of the Nile. Absolutely beautiful, and another summer blooming bulb that we didn't get to talk about. Happy planting. Wait a couple weeks before you get too excited. I know Mother's Day is kind of the signature weekend to go out and buy everything, but we are not out of the woods with frost. And I think we've all, if you've been in Colorado a while, you have been stung by those late May snows or those late May freezes. And so just be very careful. Look at the long-term forecast. And Maple the Beagle and I wish you a very successful growing season. Email me if you have questions. And then next week, we're starting a new set of classes on Wednesdays at 3 o'clock. They have been posted on the cohorts blog page, and it will be also posted on the Larimer County Extension classes page. But every week at 3 o'clock, starting next week, we'll have a class through the end of June. So please join us. We'll try to record them. Registration is required, but we would love to have you on. So I'll take any questions. If not, have a great afternoon and enjoy the sunshine. Okay, let's stop sharing. You are welcome. I'm so glad you came on today. Perfect. All right, I will stop recording.